I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Our speaker is Mr. James Frolking. Mr. Frolking was a P-38 and a P-51 fighter pilot in Europe during the Second World War. He was shot down over Holland and was rescued by, and I put the Dutch resistance, but I read later it was actually Canadians that somehow got involved in there, so you'll have to clear that up for us. As I was at a World War II enactment, the library sent me off and said, you got to go over to Brunswick to the World War II enactment and take your stuff around. I've never been to a World War II enactment. I've never been to any war enactments, and I had no idea what to expect. It was a lot of fun. I mean, bombs go off, shells go off, everything goes off, and people are, I mean, it's really kind of fun. Plus, I had never got used to the fact of so many American reenactors who are German soldiers, or German, or fascists for that matter. I met a guy, a very nice guy with a black shirt on. He was part of the September 19th Italian fascists. Yes, I think so. But it was just fascinating to talk to these people and see their program and how earnest they are and how much they really know. It was very, very interesting. You ever get a chance? Plus the other thing is, you got to know it costs over $1 a shot to shoot those bullets. You know, it's just like all that money. It's amazing. But while I'm sitting there, a guy walks up and says, oh, you do World War II? He says, you know who you ought to get? I'll tell you who you ought to get as a speaker. A guy named James Frolking. Now that guy is great. And I went, I got him, he's coming. He said, oh, he has a radio show, and evidently Jim had done a tape recording of one of his presentations, and they had played it over the radio station. But he also had taken, I guess it's on to the Library of Congress, the Memories Project, which is another thing we have to do with our tapes that we haven't started yet. But so I was very excited about that as a kind of a intro. So without further ado, the very famous Jim Frolking.
Yeah. Not famous at all, just one of the guys, one of 16 million, excuse me. Thank you. Can you all hear? On December 7th, 1941, that date that you all know about, I was a high school senior. As many of you guys are here, I see a number of World War II veterans. So I was 17 years old at the time when Pearl Harbor happened. And I knew that sometime in the next year we were at war and that we would all be called up. And I didn't want to be drafted, and I wanted to fly because I'd always been interested in airplanes. I made model airplanes and gone to the air races, the old Cleveland National Air Races out at the airport for a number of years with my family. So I loved airplanes, although I'd never been up in one. So I enlisted in the aviation cadet program when I turned 18 in April of 1942, and passed all the tests and was told to go home and wait. And then on December 7th, 1942, 1 year to the date, from Pearl Harbor, I was called to active duty, reported to Columbus, sworn into the U.S. Army, put on a train, didn't know where we were going, and headed west to California, to the West Coast Command. 3 guys in a lower and 2 in an upper berth on a troop train that seemed to take forever to get all the way out to the West Coast. We went to Santa Ana Air Force Base, which was a classification and pre-flight school, went through that and started my flight training in the West Coast at the Tulare Rankin Airfield, and flew Stearman PT-17s, that wonderful biplane that you still see flying today, open cockpit biplane. And was my first time in an aircraft was the first day I went up with my instructor, and it was a thrill of a lifetime, believe me. And from there, we spent 9 weeks there, and then we went on to the next phase, which was called basic training, and flew the Vultee Vibrator BT-13, which had a fixed landing gear and a closed cockpit and a radio, and just a little more advanced, a little more power. And then from that point, a decision was made as to whether you wanted to be a fighter pilot. Most guys wanted to be fighter pilots. Not many made it, or a bomber pilot, multi-engine, and you went on from there. And I wanted to be a fighter pilot and was lucky enough to make it, and went on to Williams Air Force Base in Phoenix, Arizona, where they had twin-engine AT-9s and what we called P322s, which was the training model of the P-38 twin-engine tricycle landing gear aircraft. If you're an air buff, you know what a P-38 is. And I graduated from flight school on November 3rd, 1942, the class of 43J. And we were sent home in our classy new uniforms, second lieutenants with nice silver wings and gold bars, and then back to operational training unit in a field in Concord, California, just near Oakland. And when we arrived on the base, we thought there'd be P-38s there, but they weren't. There were P-39s, the Airacobra, which is a tricycle landing gear aircraft. And we were a little disappointed in that, but we got to like it a little bit. I never liked it much, but some guys did. It was a very unusual aircraft. The engine was behind the cockpit, and it changed the whole dynamic of the flight. And I just didn't like it much, and a lot of guys had a little trouble with it. But we made it, and then we were there for a couple months, and then flew down to Long Beach, California, to Orange County Airport, where we flew P-38s for a couple of months. Then in April 1944, we received our orders, didn't know where we were going, and got on a train, so we figured we were going east, and we did, and we went all the way to New York, got on a boat, and headed to England. And arrived there in late April 1944, and was assigned to the 479th Fighter Group in Wattisham Air Force Base in Suffolk County, which is in East Anglia, where all the 8th Air Force was, and most of it was there. Like 129 airfields in East Anglia made up the 8th Air Force. If you can picture northeastern Ohio, which is about the same size as East Anglia in England, and put in northeastern Ohio 129 air bases. And that's what it was like. They were just like right next door, and made up all the bomber groups, the B-17s and B-24s, and the fighter groups, P-47s, P-51s, and P-38s. We were the last fighter group. We were the first replacement pilots for this fighter group, the last fighter group to be installed into the 8th Air Force in May of 1944. And I flew my first mission on D-Day, June 6, 1944. And the P-38s, because they were so recognizable, twin booms, twin engine, very different than the 51 or the 47, and weather was very skeptical all the time in England, very recognizable. So the P-38s groups were all assigned to patrol the sea lanes between England and Normandy during the invasion. And it was the most unbelievable sight that and I'll never forget it. As we were patrolling certain areas, we were assigned to sectors to patrol over the sea lanes, and you could look down and see these ships, and it looked like you could step from one ship to the next, from England all the way to France and back, and there was just one sea lane, one after the other, just thousands of ships going back and forth. So we patrolled back and forth for 2 or 3 hours, went back to our base, got something to eat, refueled, went back out again, and we flew 1 or 2 missions a day for about 7 or 8 days. From that point on, things were pretty well established, and we went on to our primary mission was to go with the bombers, escort the bombers, the B-17s and B-24s on their missions to France, to Germany, and that's what we did. And we were flying it from 20 to 30,000 feet, and I flew 50 missions in a P-38. Most were escort missions. We did do some dive bombing and some strafing, some airfield strafing trains, boats, targets of opportunity. Sometimes we would just go down onto the deck full throttle, and whatever we saw that was moving, we'd shoot at. That was our assignment. So we had all kinds of crazy things that would come and go by you so fast that you could hardly see it. In July and August of '44, word came that the P-38s were going to be phased out of the 8th Air Force. The reason being, I think there were two reasons. One, the P-51 was better at high altitude, above 25,000 feet, than the 38. The 38 was wonderful in the Pacific and was wonderful in Europe as well, but they didn't fly at high altitudes in the Pacific, not as much as we did. And we were exclusively up at high altitudes all the time. And so the 38 was not as good. Below 20,000 feet, it was equal to or better than anything I've ever flown. And it also had more mechanical problems at high altitudes, so it became somewhat of a nightmare. And so all of the groups that flew P-38s, excuse me, converted to P-51s. So in September of 1944, we converted, and we were the last group to get the 51s because we were the last group to be assigned to the 8th Air Force. So I flew 50 missions in a P-38 and 2 missions in a P-51. The first one was on October 6th, 1944, on a mission to Berlin, rather, and I flew as wingman to Colonel Hub Zemke. Some of you who are familiar with, I see some head shaking, 8th Air Force commanders, Colonel Hub Zemke, or Hubert Zemke, who was with the 56th Fighter Group and made quite a name and reputation for himself. He took over as commander of our group in August of 1944 when our commanding officer was shot down on a strafing mission. And I happened to be the wingman of that commanding officer when he was shot down that day, but he made it back okay. And so I flew with Hub Zemke on that day, my first mission in a P-51. And my second mission was on October 7th, 1944. We were flying a mission, the longest mission the group had ever had, to Brux, Czechoslovakia, which is south and east of Berlin. It was to be a 7-hour mission, and that's a long time sitting in a little cockpit. But we were used to it. We were young. I was 20 years old. And so we took off about 9:15 in the morning and headed to our target area. And as we were approaching the target area, we noticed 30 or 40 Me-109s coming in below us. And so we jettisoned our external tanks and took after these guys and chased them into the overcast and never saw them again. They disappeared. And we went on and got separated because it was kind of a melee of planes flying all over the place, and got separated from our wingmen. And so I ended up with my flight leader, and I was an element leader. There's 4 flights to a squadron. There's 4 planes to a flight. You got the flight leader, a wingman, element leader, and a wingman. So you have 4 flights, 16 airplanes to a squadron, 3 squadrons to a group. And that was our group. So my flight leader and I were heading back to England and were running low on fuel. And so we decided to land in Antwerp, Belgium, to refuel. At that point in October of '44, the British had taken over Belgium and most of Belgium, not all of it, but up to Antwerp. So Antwerp was in Belgian hands, or British hands, and we landed there to refuel. And we were there about an hour, landed about 15:30 in the afternoon, and we're there about an hour and took a little break. And I noticed as I got back in the airplane, I looked down at the harness. We wore backpack chutes and sat on a dinghy pack. And that dinghy pack was cushioned and it had 2 clips on it that hooked onto your parachute harness. And I had noticed that I had overlooked hooking those 2 clips onto my parachute harness. And I said, well, I probably won't need this, but I better hook it up just to be sure. The first time I'd ever forgotten it in all the time I'd been flying. So I hooked it up and off we went. And as we're taking off, heading right towards the city of Antwerp, we're just about 100 feet off the ground, just starting to bring our wheels up. My airplane starts to sputter. And we're at full throttle, and I said, you know, crazy thoughts go through your mind in a fleeting second. And I thought, well, here I go, right into the city of Antwerp. So I throttled back just a tad, and the engine caught right back up again. And on we went. And I figured, well, it was the fuel. We were used to 120 octane gasoline. I'm not sure what the British used, but I don't think it was quite as refined as what the Americans had. So it's probably a little bit less, maybe a little dirty or something, I don't know. But because the flight leader I was with, he also had trouble. But here we are flying, gradually flying at a climbing attitude, heading in a direction of about 310 degrees northwest towards England, and heading out over the Netherlands. The Dutch islands, which are in the lower left or western part of the Netherlands, there's a whole group of islands, and we were flying over those islands at about 5,000 feet, flying abreast, probably about 100, 200 yards apart, just comfortable, relaxed, nice, beautiful afternoon, and heading home. And then I noticed tracers coming up off the tail of my flight leader, Vic Wolski. So I radioed to Vic, and I say, Vic, they're shooting at us. And he continues to fly straight and level, and I start to do evasive action. And a few seconds after that, I hear a thump in the rear of my aircraft, and I look down at the hydraulic pressure gauge, and it notices it's on 0. And shortly after that, I wasn't sure quite what it was, because I was fairly new to this aircraft, probably only had about 10 or 15 or 20 hours in it. It was probably the tail wheel had dropped out of its housing from the hydraulic pressure going away. Then a few seconds later, my right rudder pedal dropped out from under my foot. I looked down, and the cable is limp on the floor. The plane was trimmed to fly straight and level at a climbing attitude, so it was fine. But a few seconds after that, the stick, which controls the elevators and the ailerons, went limp, and it did nothing. So I knew that I had a problem on my hands and that I had to get out of that plane, because it wouldn't last much longer without any control at all. When the right rudder pedal went, the first thing that came to mind was, how am I going to land this thing when I got back to my air base? And well, I didn't get much chance to think about that when the ailerons and the elevators went as well. So I radioed Vic and said, I've got to get out. And I pulled the canopy release, popped right off. I stood up. I had my helmet and oxygen mask and radio mics on and cables that kind of hindered my getting out of the aircraft. So I took that off and threw it into the cockpit, stood up on the side of the airplane, and dove off the right side out of the plane. And turned around and looked to make sure I was clear, pulled the ripcord. Chute opened. And I immediately reached back to make sure that that dinghy pack was with me, because I was over water. And watched my brand new P51 spiral down, hit the water, and explode. Brand new, full of gas. Probably had 20 or 50 hours on it. Kind of a sad sight. And everything got very quiet, and I'm floating down, and the leg straps on a parachute, if you've ever done any flying or jumping, you'll notice that they're very tight and become very uncomfortable. And when you're flying, when you're coming down over water, the instructions we had was, if you can drop out of your chute before you hit the water, you stand a much better chance of not getting tangled up in the shroud lines. So I released these leg straps, because they were really cramping. Excuse me. And folded my arms over my chest because if you didn't, you could slide right out of the chute, and waited to try and get into the water. And before I had a chance to even hardly think about it, I was in the water. Fortunately, the wind was to my back, and the chute went forward, so I had no problem getting tangled in the shroud lines. And I'm fumbling around getting out of the chute, and I happen to put my foot down, and I'm in water this deep. I had landed on a sandbar, and I could see land to the south of me, but it was a couple miles away, and didn't know exactly where I was. I thought it was on the mainland, but I wasn't sure. And so I fumbled around, got the dinghy out of its pack, and it had a quick release inflatable, and it popped right up, and I jumped in, got out of the chute, had a Mae West on, of course, which I inflated right away. And I noticed the sandbar, a portion of it was out of the water, about a couple hundred yards away from me. So I paddled to that, and my flight leader, Vic, he saw what happened, and so I'm paddling away towards the sandbar, the portion that was out of the water, and he flies by and waggles his wing, and I wave at him, and he goes up and radios my position, or our position at the time, and I headed towards this sandbar and got there and got out, and there were 9 bales of hay on this sandbar. It was probably about 50 by 150 feet at that point, and I decided I would stay there, hoping that Air Sea Rescue, British Air Sea Rescue, which was very good about picking up downed airmen in the North Sea and the Channel area, would come around, because he'd radioed my position. And so I decided to wait there, and I did, but it got dark and they didn't show up. And this tide started coming in, and probably about half the size of this room was left when the tide reached its highest point, where the bales of hay were. So I stayed there all night on this little sandbar. And during the night, well, one of the things, I was dressed in a flight suit, lightweight flight suit with wool pants, wool shirt, GI boots, and a leather jacket. And that's what I had on. No gloves, no hat, no food, no water. We had an escape kit that had no compass. It had a map. It had some francs and other foreign money. It had a language card. It had a sewing kit. It had some razor blades or a little shaving instrument, and Benzedrine tablets and nothing else. And that was our escape kit, we called it. We carried it in the leg pocket of our flight suit. So during the night, I was able to smoke cigarettes. We were all smokers back in those days. I carried my pack of Lucky Strikes in my chest pocket of my shirt, and when I got on the sandbar, I reached for them, and they were not wet. So I took the one out, and then my trusty Zippo lighter was in my pocket. Took that trusty Zippo lighter out, blew on it a few times, and it lighted right up, just as reliable as ever. And so that was a great relief. And so during the night, I just wandered around, smoked cigarettes, wondering what was going on. And I noticed a ship coming by. It had a couple of lights on it. That's all I could see. It was a dark, starry night, no moon. And the ship came by, and I remembered we had in the dinghy pack were some flares. So I went over to the dinghy, which was pulled up on the shore, and reached in and got one of the flares out. And I'd never shot one of these things off before. So I figured out how to do that, and off it went, but it had a heck of a kick, like a 45, and it popped out of my hand, and I'm standing right next to the dinghy, and it popped down into the dinghy and burned a hole about that big in the bottom of the dinghy. I said, that's a pretty stupid thing for you to do, but it happened, and there's nothing I could do about it. So I said, there goes the dinghy. So I waited till morning, and at morning time it was fogged in solid. But it was a nice clear night and warm, and the water was calm. And by about 11 o'clock in the morning, the sun burned off the fog and I could see land to the south of me. And I said, well, I've got to head out of here. I can't stay here. So I said, I can't use the dinghy. So I took my boots off and tied them around my neck, or can't remember exactly how I did that, but I blew up my Mae West and started out. I was going to swim. And the water got deeper and got colder. And I get up to about chest deep, and all of a sudden I think about the sewing kit in the escape kit. And I went back and I sewed up that hole and reinflated the dinghy and started out. And that never leaked a drop in 2 hours of paddling to the next to land. It got a little windy, so there was some current, and it blew me to the south as I headed, or blew me west, I guess, and headed southwest. But it took about 2 hours to get across this area of water. I was accompanied by some dolphins that swam around the area where I was, not too close, but I didn't worry too much about them. Finally came to shore, and if you know Holland, most of Holland is reclaimed land, so there are dikes around much of the area of Holland. And I came upon a dike, and it just happened the area where I was making landfall, there was a wooden fence along the base of the dike, so I got out of the dinghy and deflated it and pushed it up against the fence, so anybody walking across the top of the dike would not be able to see it. And so then I crawled up on the dike and looked both ways, and I looked to my left and I see two men in civilian clothes, 100 yards away maybe, on top of the dike, talking. So they had seen me, so I just walked up to them, and they had noticed, they knew who I was. They had seen me come down the day before, and they took me to a house that was maybe a half a mile away, right near the dike. And this house was occupied by a young couple that had an infant. And they took me up to a loft on the second floor and brought food, and I rested. And they came back in the afternoon with a map, or I had a map, and they were trying to convince me that the British were on the other side of where I was. They told me where I was. I was on the island of North Beveland. There's North Beveland, South Beveland, there's Schuwen, Overflakkee. There's a number of islands there. This is south of Rotterdam, north of Antwerp, if you know your geography of that part of the country, and water all around. And but I was on the island, the north shore of the island of North Beveland, and they came back at night and escorted me out of the house. I knew I couldn't stay there with this family with a young infant. They didn't want me there at all. But they were very nice to keep me there for a few hours anyway, until it got dark. Then he escorted me down the road for just a very short distance, said, go that way, the British are on the other side. And I didn't believe him, but I had no way to confirm it one way or the other. And off I went. And it was very dark. I could hear dogs would bark occasionally as I'd walk by a farmhouse down this road. I didn't smoke. I didn't want to lighted cigarette, can be seen great distances at night. While I was walking, a very large artillery battle started to the south of where I was headed, and a number of miles away, but it just lighted up the sky like a huge thunderstorm and lightning, and it was amazing. I could hear it. And I found out later it was the Canadians who were moving up through southern Belgium into the Netherlands. So I get to the other end of this island, and there's a fork in the road, and I go take left fork, and I go down not very far, and I run into a sign that says verboten. And I knew what that meant, so I turn around and go back to the fork and head the other direction and come upon a small village. And there was a guardhouse out on the edge of town, nobody in it, and you never went into a village or a town at night. There was curfews, nobody was supposed to be out, so I immediately turned around and went out, not very far, and selected, there were homes spotted along, farm homes spotted along this road, and I picked one out, and across the street from it was a hay wagon. So I crawled underneath the hay wagon and buried myself and actually went to sleep. I was very tired. And the next morning, I was awakened by a horse who came by and must have sensed my presence and whinnied and woke me up. And I got up and looked around. There was no people. I saw the house. I walked across the street around to the back door. Always go to the back door, never the front door. And knocked on the door, and this little boy comes to the door and looks at me, and I get out my language card that says, you know, I had a number of phrases. I'm an American flyer, or whatever it said in Dutch. I knew I was in Holland. And he looked at me and walked away. And then a couple minutes later, his father came to the door, had shaving cream on, and it was early morning. And he looked at me, and I showed him the language card, and he gave me the once-over and invited me in. And his wife was preparing breakfast, and they sent me upstairs to a second-floor bedroom, closed the door, and brought up food and a towel and soap, and I washed and felt halfway decent. And they brought food to me, and then a couple of hours later, a man came with a typed sheet of paper, and all in English, and said that I had made contact with the Dutch underground, and that later in the day, I'd be taking a bicycle ride. I'd be given civilian clothes. I was on an occupied island. There were Germans there. It was not a strategically military island for the Germans, but they were there. They were everywhere. And so he came back that evening, and we changed clothes. I was not to take any of my clothing with me except my shoes, my underwear, and socks, of course. And no ID, no guns, no anything. Well, I didn't give up my dog tags, obviously. I don't remember about the Zippo lighter and the cigarettes. I think I still kept those too. I had kept my watch. That probably wasn't make much sense because it was a GI issue watch and it said, you know, Army Air Force on it or something like that. But regardless, I did that, and so I was dressed up in a white turtleneck sweater and pants and a hat and a jacket. And off we went on our bicycle ride, and I was told not to speak to anybody. And I would follow this man, and we'd be bicycling for a while. And we did, and didn't see anybody, fortunately, and it was dusk. By the time we got to our destination, it was dark. And we pulled around the back of this farmhouse, had two large barns, and parked by a tree. And I waited there, and he went inside, and a few minutes later, a nice young man, very nicely dressed, came out and walked up to me and said, "How do you do?" in English. And this young man was a Dutch policeman who was part of the underground movement. His name was Willem de Voer, and he, after the war, emigrated to Canada and has since died. But I was at the home of the Maas family, Vandermaas, Isaac and Marie Maas, and their 5-year-old son, Huib, H-U-I-B. And he was asleep, of course, because it was after dark. That's why the timing was such. And I was going to stay with this family indefinitely. So they had prepared a room up on the second floor for me, without windows. It had a skylight. And I was to stay there up on that second floor, which I did. And at night, when Huib went to bed, I would come downstairs and for the evening meal, and they were very gracious. They were a farm family, a fairly prosperous farm family. They had about 400 acres of land, which in the Netherlands is pretty large. And being such a small country, about half the size of the state of Maine is the whole country of the Netherlands. So that was the routine. Mrs. Vandermaas, Marie, would bring food up to me in the morning, and at night I would come downstairs, and Willem would come over, and we would talk, and he would translate. And they wanted to know all about America, and we talked about the war. I had the BBC on occasionally. Electricity wasn't on all the time, And it was a very nice house. The stairway, it wasn't really a stairway, it was kind of like a ladder stair. It was very unusual. I'd never seen anything like it to get up to this second floor area. There was no bathroom up there. And so the food was potatoes and apples and a wonderful pastry dish called a pannekuchen. And it's a very flat, thin pancake that they would cover butter, or not butter, but jelly and powdered sugar or something like that, and roll it up and eat it that way. And tea, no coffee, no milk. And so I had plenty of food, not much meat, a little bit of fish, but not much. And so it was mostly that kind of diet. But it was fine, and I just felt very, very lucky. No scratch, no injuries, no nothing. And it was determined I was going to stay there. They knew the Allies were coming up. The Germans were there, and the Germans were moving north. I came downstairs a couple of times and looked out a window when young Hybe was not in the house, and would see the Germans coming through the farm area and moving north. They had arranged to have some kind of house cleaning done while I was there. They didn't want to change the routine, so they figured I'd had to move. So one night they took me into the next village, and I stayed a couple of days with Isaac's father, kindly old Dutch gentleman with a white goatee and the typical curly type of pipe, and he was right in a town, so I could stand behind the lace curtains and watch the German soldiers go back and forth, marching and parading or whatever they were doing. I was there a couple of days and then came back, and one night when I was downstairs, the routine was that I would use the bathroom, which they had, a very nice bathroom, right by the back door. A little vestibule, not very large, a back door that went into the rather large kitchen sitting room. They didn't use their living room area at all because of the heat and the light. And the bathroom was off of this vestibule. So I'm in the bathroom, and a knock comes on the door. Fortunately, Willem was there, and the routine was that if this should ever happen, there was a signal that they told me about, one word, I forget what it was. I should have remembered that word, but I don't. And I was to move as quickly as I could up to my room. Well, a knock came on the door, and it was 3 German officers. And so both of the men were outside. One of them came in, opened the bathroom door, gave the signal. Jim pulls up his pants and races up the steps to the bedroom. And the 3 German officers weren't looking for me. They wanted a place to sleep. And the 3 German officers wanting a place to sleep is like a grizzly bear, you know, wherever they want to sleep, they can. And this family had an extra bedroom. Their son slept in with them. They had another bedroom on the first floor, which was right underneath the bedroom where I was staying. So these 3 German officers stayed there. And of course, it was up quickly upstairs. They never noticed a thing. And I never breathed, moved, slept, and listened to them. And they were talking and talking. And the next morning they left without incident. And another lucky happenstance for me. So a couple of days after that, 2 gentlemen came and whisked me away and took me in a small rowboat to the next island to the South Babeland. They took me out so fast I didn't even have a chance to say goodbye to the Maas family. Isaac was out on doing farm work. Marie was in the house doing something, and I just kind of waved to her and off we went. And took me to the next island and dropped me off in a village. And shortly thereafter, a Canadian reconnaissance outfit, the Royal Dragoons, they were called, came into town. Wonderful bunch of men, and they stopped, and I went up to them and told them who I was. And their comment was, "We find you guys in the oddest places." So that was my contact with the Allies. They would not let me go back. I wanted to go back to North Babeland, but they said, no, until that island is liberated, you're not going anywhere. And so they would not let me go back. And so I stayed with them most of the day. They were looking for what is called quislings, German sympathizers, and didn't find any, but they found some interesting things, and they gave me a couple of mementos to bring home. So I was driven into Antwerp, where I was interrogated for 3 days, given a physical. I'd contracted scabies while I was in this farmhouse, and so I had to soak myself in a tub for a couple of days in this god-awful purple solution of some kind, but it cleared it up. I was given a Canadian uniform. I sent a cablegram home to my mother from there. What happens is when you're shot down and you're called missing in action, the government waits 2 weeks before they notify your family. So my mother received this telegram, you know, we got to inform you that your son so-and-so is missing in action. When we find out any more information, we'll let you know. Well, about 1 week after that, she gets the telegram or the cablegram from me that I'm okay. So that was a happy occasion for her and wonderful. And it arrived in Cleveland on the 50th anniversary of my grandparents. Were having a party, and so it was a happy day for that family, our family. So after I was interrogated and given a Canadian uniform without any insignia, I went to the officers club without even giving it a thought. They gave me some money. I was an officer, I was a first lieutenant, and these guys are sitting around this officers club and looked at me with funny expression, but nobody challenged me. I think I ordered something and then went into town and spent the evening in Antwerp, and came back. The next day I was driven to Brussels, flown to Paris for a night. Paris was liberated by then, of course, and then flown back to England, to London area, and then took a train up to my airbase, still in this Canadian uniform, and walked onto my airbase and was not challenged by anybody. That wouldn't happen today. The base, Wadisham Airfield, is still a permanent military air base. It was built in the 30s for the RAF. The United States Army Air Force took over in 1943. Our group moved in 1944 and left in 1945. Shortly thereafter, the RAF came back and flew out of there for many years, and then about 15 years ago, they left and the Royal Army moved in, and that's what's there now. They have an air-sea rescue operation, and they fly Apache helicopters out of that base now, and they've been in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I've been back to the airfield 3 times, or 4 times actually. Last time was in 2005, where we had a dedication of an RAF and USAAF memorial. It was quite a wonderful, wonderful experience. But when I got back to the base, being an evadee, my tour of duty in the European theater was over with. And the reason for that is that if I were ever shot down again and caught and were interrogated, the Germans are very good at that, and they could possibly find out that I had been shot down before, because it was in the newspaper in our hometown, you know, Jim Frolking missing in action. So they read the newspaper. They knew more about you than you knew about yourself. So all evadees or escapees, if they came back, they were not allowed to operate in that theater again. So my tour was over with. I had about 208 hours of combat time. Our tour was for 300 hours, which would be around 65 missions. I had 52 missions. So in November, late November, I flew home on Thanksgiving Day and into Washington, and then home with the family, and down to Miami, Florida for some R&R, and then back home again for Christmas, and then back down again. And then we transferred. There were a lot of pilots. They didn't really know what to do with us. And I didn't find out till later. I thought maybe I'd go to the Pacific, but I didn't find out until about a year or so ago, when I got some records, old military records, and printed very visibly on the bottom of one record that I had never seen before. It said, "This officer is not to be assigned outside the continental United States." So I never knew why. I was never sent to the Pacific Theater. I ended up in Abilene, Texas at an operational training unit flying P-47s. I'd never sat in a P-47 before, and I was to be an instructor, and I loved the P-47, a great aircraft. And we had new pilots from South America, from Argentina, and we would teach them combat techniques. And they were nice guys. We had a little difficulty with translation, talking to them, but they were wonderful pilots and a good time. And then the war ended. Well, when the atom bomb dropped in the Pacific, I got a call saying I had enough points to get out, and I did. I decided to come home, and I had the option of staying in. I decided I didn't want to, and I came home, although I stayed in the active reserves for about 5 years and flew AT-6s out of Cleveland for 2 or 3 years. I was in 1950, I was invited by the Indiana Air National Guard, who were flying P-51s. They were looking for pilots, and they invited me to join them, and I considered it, but decided not to. My dear wife, Patty, was expecting our second child at that point, and we decided that would not be a smart thing to do. I'd had good luck, bailed out of a plane, piled up 2 other aircraft, and never got a scratch. In 1977 or in the 80s, we went back to Holland for the first time. And well, let me digress a minute. In 1960, see, this little 5-year-old boy, I had never seen him. And we had corresponded back and forth, sent pictures and all that kind of thing. And this family was so wonderful. You know, I'm indebted to them. They saved my life. In 1960, we get a knock on the door at our home, and here's this 5-year-old boy who's now 21 years old, strapping, tall boy, and they're farmers, so he'd been over in this country on the 4-H Club program. He'd been in South Dakota and South Carolina and working on farms, and came to see us. And so we had a wonderful reunion together. Took him to our elementary school where our kids were, and he gave a talk, and he had pictures of the family. So we've been in very close touch with this wonderful, wonderful family. And when we went back in the 80s to see Marie, and her husband Isaac had since died, we had a very emotional reunion, and it was just wonderful. We've been back a second time, and we've been kept in touch. Marie, she died last year at age 94, lived to be a ripe old age. She was a tough old gal. They had a second son born after the war who's now farming the farm, the Maas farm. He's younger than Hybe. Hybe has just turned 70. He's a grandfather. And he came to this country in April, back in April of this year. We had the good fortune to go to the Air Force Escape and Evasion Society meeting, which was down in Savannah, Georgia, which I'm a member of. And they held it right near the 8th Air Force Museum in Pooler, Georgia, which is right outside of Savannah. If you've not been to that museum and have interest, it's a wonderful museum and just terrific. And it's not that big where it overwhelms you. And it's right on the Interstate 95. You can see it as you're zipping by in Pooler, Georgia. And the reunion was held there, and Hybe and his daughter, who we'd seen when she was in high school, she's now 37 years old, and a mother and a lawyer and a wonderful woman, came with him because he unfortunately has Parkinson's and cannot travel alone, but he's in pretty good shape. Tough guy. And so we had a wonderful time together, and we talk on the phone regularly, and just it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience. So that's basically my story. I'll try and answer one question that's usually asked. Which airplane did you like better? The P-38 or there's a typo here, that's a P-51 Mustang. That's all right. The Mustang. And both great airplanes. You talk to P-51 pilots, there's one sitting right here in the front row, and they'll tell you that the P-51 is better than the P-38. Well, it's not. What I liked about the P-38 is a couple of things. Number one, it had tricycle landing gear, which was wonderful when you were on the ground. If you've ever flown an airplane, a tail dragger, where you have an engine up here, in a small plane like these Cessnas, it's not so bad, but you get a big single-engine fighter plane with a P-47 or P-51, and you have this huge engine in front of you, high up, and you can't see a thing. So you have to fishtail when you taxi. You can't just go straight down the road. In a tricycle gear, you can, and it's wonderful. So you can taxi much faster and with much less trouble. Secondly, the P-38 had counter-rotating props. And if you've flown a single-engine aircraft, you're familiar with torque. The more powerful the engine you have in an aircraft, the more torque you have. So in a P-30, in a P-51 or a P-47, where you've got 1,500 horsepower, the P-47 had a 2,000 horsepower Wright Cyclone radial engine in it. You have tons of torque, which means you got to really step on that right rudder when you're taking off at full throttle. P-38, you didn't have to do any of that. You just went full throttle, and you could almost take your feet off the pedals, and off it went. And the third thing I liked about it was the firepower was straight ahead. We had four 50 caliber machine guns and a 20 millimeter cannon firing straight out of the fuselage nacelle. In both single engine aircraft, the guns are in the wings and they converge out a few hundred yards in front. Much more difficult to judge distances when you're flying this way. And that's three things I liked. Both aircraft were as good speed-wise, maneuverable, one as good as the other. Some thought that the P-51 had a longer range. I don't think so. I flew to Berlin in a P-38 when we had external tanks, which we didn't get until the early days of 1944, which made quite a difference to the 8th Air Force. Then the fighters could escort the bombers all the way in and all the way back. Before that time, before the advent of those drop tanks, fighter escort was much more limited, and so the Germans really had a field day on the bombers, although they were more fearful of flak than they were of German fighters, because flak they couldn't do anything about, and it would just come up to them, and when they were on their what was called their initial point, when they were going down to the target, they couldn't maneuver at all. They just had to stay right there, and that's when the flak came up. And it was sad. I saw some horrible sights of bombers being hit by flak, and they would just explode, or pieces would be flying all over the place. We could outmaneuver the flak. We'd stay away from it, and we flew 2 to 3 times as fast as the bombers did. They would lumber along at 150 miles an hour when they were fully loaded with fuel and bombs, and we would cruise at about 280 to 300. So we were up and around, and it was a merry time. It was a great experience, and I was very, very lucky. So that's my story. A little bit different than you usually hear, but no different than a lot of others. And I'll take whatever questions you'd like.
After he waved and said that he had seen you, what happened to him?
I'll tell you what happened to him. He, of course, he couldn't stay around forever. He had to get back to base, and there was a long way to go. He had a good hour and a half of flight time to get back to the base from where we were. And he headed out, and I didn't find this out until after I got back. And he had engine failure over the North Sea and bailed out and spent the night in the North Sea and was picked up by Air Sea Rescue the next day. He obviously had maydayed his position, but it was night, it was dark by the time this happened, and he had engine trouble, so it must have been the fuel. And it could have happened to me, I don't know, or both of us. But he was fine. He survived, no problem, and finished his tour and went home. Yes. Yes, sir. He asked about the P-39 and was it difficult to fly and did it overheat. I don't recall about the overheating. I just didn't like the way it handled because the engine was behind the cockpit. You straddled the drive shaft to the propeller. It had a 37 millimeter cannon which was right in front of it, which we never used. And I just didn't like the way it handled. I thought it was underpowered. I had a little incident on landing once, and I thought I'd made a good landing, and all of a sudden I'm down on one wing and sliding along the runway and bending the propeller, and found out that the wheel strut had broken off up in the wing, and the maintenance people hadn't caught it. And but I wasn't injured. They thought it was my fault, of course, but it wasn't. I was vindicated when made. Yes, sir.
After the war, did you do much piloting?
Very little. I flew AT-6. That's the Texan. You've seen it. It's been used in movies. It's an advanced trainer. Nice aircraft, still flying today. And they had them in Cleveland, and I flew out of the Cleveland airport for a couple of years. Not much, no. I've flown a little bit of small aircraft, but nothing. Yes, sir.
Sir, did you have the opportunity to fly the P-38 in actual combat against, say, FW-190s or?
Yes, yes.
How was the aircraft? I heard that it was not that great of a dogfighter.
P-38 was as good as any fighter we had. I think it's basically not the aircraft, I think it's the pilot. You know, some pilots are better than others, some drivers are better than others. I thought I was a good pilot. I was not a hot shot. You know, I was not an ace, and I was not a daredevil. Most of the daredevils didn't survive. I mean, but no, the P-38 was as good as any aircraft. It depends on the circumstance, how you were confronted, what advantage did you have or what advantage did they have. And to me, it was the pilot's capability. We didn't run into too many German fighters. Only a few times did we have encounters. Some groups and squadrons saw them lots more than we did, but we just didn't. I know a couple guys that did their entire tour with our group and never fired their guns. Just never had the opportunity. And but I did a number of times. And yeah, strafing the ground on ground aircraft was kind of fun. Yes, sir.
You were talking about your squadron of 4 where you had 2 wingmen and a squad leader.
No, you had a squadron had 4 flights, and each flight comprised 4 aircraft. Right. A flight leader, a wingman, an element leader, and a wingman. So you had 4.
What was an element leader?
Well, he was the number 3. Okay. So if you got split up, you stayed in pairs always. You tried not to ever be by yourself. So your wingman would stay with you no matter where you went. When you got into combat, you didn't fly tight formation. We would spread out and be right up almost side by side, but spread out so you could look around a little bit. You had to keep your head moving constantly. And if you're flying tight formation, you can't do that. Yeah. Yes.
Did you encounter any of the German jets on your escort missions?
No, I never saw one, although one of the fellows in our group, Art Jeffrey, who was an ace with one of the other squadrons, shot down the first Me-163, which was the rocket ship, the smaller one. He caught him, you know, at high altitude in a climb, and I guess he was almost out of fuel, and got him. He was flying a P-38 also and shot down this rocket ship. But no, we never saw the Me-262.
What tactics were you taught to deal with them, considering the speed differential?
Ooh, I don't recall any tactics we were taught. I mean, it was such a superior aircraft to what we had, and that was another mistake that Hitler made. If he had said, let's make it a fighter instead of a bomber, it might have made a difference in the war, because it was a fantastic aircraft for its time. Yes.
That you was in the reserves in Cleveland?
Yes.
At Euclid Avenue?
No, Cleveland Airport.
Oh, at the airport?
Yeah.
Oh,
They
I
had a
was gonna
reserve
say,
base over
because
there
my-
on the other side where NASA is now,
Mm-hmm.
before NASA was there.
Because my brother and I went to reserves on Euclid Avenue
Right.
when it was there for
Right.
about 6 years.
Yeah, yeah,
Something like that.
yeah, no.
And then I want to comment on your describing the 51, P51 and the 38. I just like to say that I got about 8 hours sitting in a P38 at Luke Field because they was getting assigned to us. I just about got into them.
Right, right.
But you shipped a bunch of pilots back from overseas and they took it away from us, and I had to go on an old P40.
Yeah, yeah, the old Curtis Kitty Hawk, yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, there's only maybe a half a dozen P-38s that are flying in the world today. This gentleman and I both had the chance last September to go to Columbus to the gathering of Mustangs. A wonderful, great air show, and there were like 100 P-51s there, all privately owned, all pristine, and all flyable. And it was an exciting, wonderful, wonderful experience. And so that was great. Yes?
P51 had a Packard engine?
Yeah, it had the Packard Merlin engine in it. Yeah, when the P-51 was first developed by North American, it was sent to England by the United States Army Air Force, and it had an Allison engine in it, the same thing that's in the Lockheed P-38. And the British, this was in like 1942 or something like that, or early 43, and they took it up and flew it and said, we don't want it. And they said, why don't you try this engine in it? The Packard Merlin engine, which was in the Spitfire. And the Americans did, and that made all the difference in the world. It was a fantastic aircraft. Yes?
I had heard that if you had to bail out of a P-38, you had to turn upside down.
Right, right. Yeah, the P-38, well, you can see one right here. You've got this horizontal stabilizer in the back between the two booms. And if you're not careful, if you would slide out of the wings or the fuselage to go out, you could hit that stabilizer. So the best thing to do was either to slow it down and be in a climb where you could slide out and go underneath it, or roll it over and drop out, if you could. Let me tell you, when you have to get out of an airplane in an emergency, you don't think about those kinds of things. You just go. Yeah. Yeah, I can remember my son saying, my father jumped out of that airplane. You just never give it a second thought.
There's two things that I want to comment that I noticed. That one of them was he had a little incident with his plane, and the wing fell off practically. Kind of a way to describe something that is sort of traumatic to the average, people. And I think also was about your record. According to this gentleman that called me tonight, he said that you actually got credited for a damage in a dogfight. I have no idea what that is, but that's what
yeah, I have one destroyed on the ground, one damaged, and one probable in the air. Yeah, my first encounter, I was a little overzealous. I think I was a little out of range, but I did notice some strikes because we had gun cameras, and that's how they would verify this. And when we came back after every mission, we were debriefed, and they would look at the gun camera if you used your guns at all, and they would ask you what you did and what you saw and all about it. Everybody did that. And then they would verify it with the gun camera. And I have a reel of the camera film that they gave me when I came home. They edited, of course, take all the good stuff out. But I do have a couple of interesting shots in it. Yeah. So on that first time, it was one other thing happened, and I'm zeroing in on this Focke-Wulf 190, and we had a mirror up on the canopy right above our head, and I happened to look, a rear view mirror, and I happened to look up, and here's a Focke-Wulf 190 coming up on me right on my tail. And he had greater speed at that point than I did, and he was off to my left. And I was a bit shocked, of course, and he came right up to me, side by side. We looked at one another. He peeled that way, I peeled this way. Why he didn't shoot, I don't know. He had me dead to rights. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Did you ever run into compressibility problems with P-38?
No, they did have some problems. I did once in a P51 on the first mission I flew when I was with Hub Zemke. The weather was horrible, and all of a sudden he just peeled over and headed straight down, and I'm his wingman, so I'm following him. And I got up to 550 miles an hour going straight down, and my plane started to shudder. And you know, the nose can pull in, and you can have a heck of a time pulling out of it. So I throttled back, and I lost him. And he never said anything when we got back to the air base, but I did find out that this man, being the commanding officer, he had his plane waxed. And of course, none of us could have our planes waxed. And that made a difference. He had less resistance. He could go just a little bit faster than everybody else. And maybe that's why he had 26 victories or something like that. Wonderful, interesting man. He was shot down, by the way, or actually went down in December of '44 in another mission where he had bad weather. Ended up as a POW at Stalag 3 in Barth, Germany. And being a full colonel, he was the senior ranking Allied officer on that base and was the commanding officer of that POW camp for about 4 months. He's got an interesting book about that if you ever want to read an interesting story. Yes, sir.
When you first got to England, were you combat ready at that point?
Well, I would say no. Were we combat ready when we got to England? No. We spent a few weeks in training, yes. Got there in early May. This was a brand new group, so the fellows that were there, who we considered our seniors, were not much, they didn't have much more combat time than we did. But we did a lot of training, oh, absolutely, for a couple of weeks. So I didn't fly my first mission until June 6th, so I was there about 2 weeks before I flew my first mission. But we would fly every day on training missions, yes.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up, so we'll take one last question.
How long, from the time you went down until you put on the Canadian uniform, what was the last time?
About a month. Yeah, very lucky. I've read some hair-raising stories of escape and evasion through France, Belgium, and Holland. Prior to the invasion, when the airmen went down, you know, the resistance was scattered all over that part of the country, and these guys would take months to get out, go all the way through France, or from Holland, all the way through Holland, Belgium, France, down to the Pyrenees, cross the Pyrenees into Spain to get home and have hair-raising experiences. So there's some wonderful stories out about this. Mine was a piece of cake in comparison, but you never know, you know, I was lucky, feel very lucky. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.